with that piece in place. Let's put a wipe of synthetic grease around here. This is where the buttons go, top and bottom. Get the buttons and their springs. Fit these in place. Note that the springs go in the holes in the buttons, the hollows in the buttons. They do not go over the post on the button. If you try to fit them over the post on the button, it's not going to go well for you. Right, they're in. I'm holding them in with my fingers, and I'll slide these two pieces together. And they snap nicely into position. At this stage I'll put some synthetic grease on the rail here, top and bottom, where the two sections slide together. And I've just collapsed that back down inside there. And I'll put some more on that rail towards the front, and this here, right here where the button runs against that surface, that needs to get a bit of synthetic grease too. That seems to move smoothly enough. That is virtually ready to go back in the camera, except I've got to add this piece. This is that little piece that the shutter release runs on, so I've got to swing that into position. Then I collapse this slightly, which traps this piece in place, otherwise it'll fall out, and then I'd have to pull it all apart again to put it back. So far so good with that one. The body. Now the body needs the gear put in place. It's the little bracket that holds it, and of course the screw that holds the bracket. So I'll apply some grease, synthetic grease, to the shaft and gear. Pop that in place in the body. There it is there. Put the bracket in place, and a single screw holds that from the top, and it's like no other screw on the camera, so it's hard to mix it up with anything. Here we go. But we're not done with that. I can't just tighten that screw up. That bracket here can be shifted slightly forward or slightly back. If it's too far back, it jams the rack and the rack can't move smoothly. If it's too far forward, the shaft and the rack are able to float relative to each other, and then you end up with the rack only running partially over the gear, and the teeth on the rack or the gear wear prematurely. So I have found from experience that a good clearance is put the rack in place and use a 4/1000th of an inch feeler gauge, pull everything back in position, and check the action when you're done. And that should be good. Now the bracket tends to want to swing as you tighten the screw up, as things do. So you need to make sure that it is square. I'm checking again that the rack runs smoothly, and it does. So that's good. That's all I need to do with that. Normally I put a little drop of lacquer on that screw head there to encourage it not to shift. That's good. Now this front section can go in place. So I've got to slide that on, making sure that the shaft comes through the hole. Push this back into position. And I've got 4 screws that go in here. 2 of them have probably got glue on them because they've come from the base of the camera, they're the ugly ones. And 2 of them are not quite so ugly, but are very often slightly distorted, just because they've had to do a lot of work and people have tightened them up a long way. At the top of the camera, these are going into those little bushes or threaded bushes or inserts. It's very easy to disturb the position of the inserts, so be very gentle putting these screws in so that you don't push the inserts out of position. Otherwise that can be a bugger to put back in position. You need to get all 4 screws started before you do anything up tight. That's it. Now remembering that 2 of these inserts had been glued into position. One of them was loose and mutilated and didn't want to go back in its socket. The other one was firmly in position because it was glued there, but the glue had run right down into the threads of the screws, making it awkward to remove them. The bushes or inserts that I've taken out of the camera, I have here in front of me at the moment. I'm just inspecting those. Yeah, there's certainly traces of glue inside the threads of those, so that's why it was difficult to get those pieces out. Okay, don't pull the front out into position because that little arm down there will be able to fall because it won't be held in by anything. So I'm putting the shutter release shaft in position, and I note that now it moves freely as it didn't do before, and now I could extend the front without there being any disasters. Right, we'll just close that off back where we were. I want to get these pieces in place. This is the little well that the bottom of the film cassette sits into, and the tripod socket sits on top of that, and there are 3 screws that hold that in place. Now normally on retinas these screws are very commonly loose. On this particular camera they weren't. Given the number of other loose screws on the camera, that's probably a minor miracle. Right, so they're all in place. I'll do them up tight. That's good. So what else can we do? Right, well the focus mount here can go in place. That's all been cleaned. I put that through the ultrasonic cleaner. It's been through on the solvent, and it had 10 minutes in the ultrasonic cleaner on with the solvent. I didn't give it 10 minutes on the ultrasonic cleaner with the detergent mix because that has a tendency to strip the colour out of the anodising sometimes, in which case you've got to go through the tedious business of re-blackening it. So I just hand cleaned that after it had been through the solvent. which isn't difficult. So I'm getting these screws in position. I've got the correct 4 screws for this job. I think we had 3 of the correct screws there earlier. One of them was holding the back catch release cover in place instead. Right, so I put that shutter release shaft back in there so that I don't lose anything. I've pulled this out to the full extent, and I want to check the inner and outer focus helical here. Now I've got a, what have I got on there? Well, I've got a piece of something stuck on here. I'm not sure what that is. Something is stuck into the thread. I have to make sure that that's all gone before I try assembling that, otherwise it'll just be very stiff. I would say that that's lumps of adhesive that have come away from something else in the cleaner and have settled in here just to cause me grief. I could run this through the solvent and clean it again, but I think we'll get away with this one. Of course, the focus was very, very stiff. Which in itself is a little bit unusual, given that somebody has obviously had all the focus components apart at some stage, probably in comparatively recent times, given all the obvious mistakes that were there. Right, so I'm just running a little bit of naphtha onto these threads as I roll these components backwards and forwards through each other to make sure that the action is smooth. That feels good. Now I've got to make sure I get my marks aligned correctly. So I'm looking to see where my marks are. I can see a double mark here, so I am round about a quarter of a turn almost. Getting multi-start threads to start is always entertaining. Right, I'm 1 notch out, I'd say. I think there's 15 or 16 starts on this thread. That's it. That's where it should be. I've got both surfaces are level and the lines are marked up. The marks line up, so that's the correct spot. So I've got that correctly assembled. I'm just going to run a bit more naphtha down there and work that once or twice. If there's any dry patches of oxidation or something, putting a bit of naphtha and then working it backwards and forwards will quite likely, the 2 components will polish that stuff away. And you can tell if it's going to be smooth because it'll feel smooth and you know that you've done the job. That's good. Well, that I can put some helical grease on there, and the stuff I'm using is Halimax XP, and I usually put the grease on in about 5 or 6 patches around the outside. You don't need to completely clog all the threads with grease. If you do that, you'll find that you have a very heavy focus action. I'm just working that to make sure it's smooth. It certainly appears to be good. Now I'll run some around the outside where this sits down in the focus mount. Right, now There are two alignment pins, they're the ones with the holes at the top, so I'll just put a spot in both of those. Make sure this is round the right way. I know my double line is at the bottom of the camera, single line towards the top. This should drop over the alignment post smoothly. I wouldn't say that that was lining up smoothly, that felt a little bit tight. Let me just check the action. No, I think that's fine. So we have this piece, this is the retainer that holds it all together. So I'll put a little bit of grease on the inside edge of that where it holds down that outer helical. And it doesn't need much. Pop that into position. And this time I will use the correct screws for the job because the previous person had mixed and matched them. There are 4 countersunk screws and 4 that are not. They'd just been mixed up. Perhaps whoever had a go at it wasn't wearing their glasses that day. I suppose some people just aren't especially observant. Get those 4 screws in position. When they're all in position, tighten those 4 up. Check the action of the helical again. Yeah, that moves smoothly. Right, I'll collapse the front down. So I've got to put the 4 screws through here that go all the way through to the bellows at the back. And these will hold the bellows to the back of the front standard. That's 3 of them. Where's the 4th one? There it is. As usual, get all 4 screws started. Once all the 4 screws are started, then you can go around and tighten them up. They're all in. Tighten them now. Right, so now the bellows are held to the back of the front standard. And here I've got our focus scale ring, which I'm just looking at because it appears I haven't cleaned that yet. I'll just give that a quick wipe with some naphtha. Looks a bit grimy. And of course, because 2 of the screws were incorrect here previously, 2 of the screws were incorrect here because they've been swapped over. Giving this a wipe, just checking those scales. They look a little bit, just checking that they all match. A little bit rougher than I would normally like to see, but then the whole camera's had a hard life. 4 screws hold this in place, and of course I've got my alignment marks there to work from. So I don't do the screws up tight, get 4 screws in position. When they're all in position, then make sure your alignment is correct and then nip the screws up. These screws do not need to be done up very tight. When everything is correct, when the lubrication is correct, the focus mount will turn smoothly. These screws only need to be done up tight enough to keep the focus scale ring aligned with the outer helical. You don't need to crank it up hard. If you do, just make sure that alignment's good, that's good. If you do, what happens is that you end up distorting things. You will distort the outer helical and the focus will be stiffer, and it should be, the action will be stiff. That moves very smoothly. That's great. Now I've got this piece. This is the piece that goes on the front of the inner helical and has the arm that attaches through to the rangefinder. Now this has been through the ultrasonic cleaner. It's lost any and all lubricant at this hinge point here. So this is the only spot in the camera that I typically use any oil. And I'll put a single drop of oil on that hinge point. And work that in. Otherwise that would be too stiff, because all that's lubricant had been stripped out in the cleaning process, and that would be too stiff, and then so the focus action wouldn't be as smooth as it should be. That's great. All it took was a very tiny drop of oil to do that, and that's Nye oil that I used for doing that job. And I used that mostly because I got a bottle of Nye oil probably 20 years ago, and I haven't used it up yet. Not when you're using tiny quantities like that. 2 small screws hold this in place on the inner helical. These are very similar but slightly smaller than the 4 screws that held the focus scale ring in place. So you need to be watching out for the size of these screws to make sure you're putting the right thing in the right place. If you put a screw in place that's the wrong size because it's one size too small, it'll go and it won't tighten up correctly, but it can often be very, very difficult to get it back out of the hole. So here's the post that goes on the end of that arm, and which in turn couples to the rangefinder. Just getting that in position. And as the focus is turned, the arm pulls forward, and so that post pulls forward or goes back. That's good. And I'll put a little bit of grease in the track there where that little stud runs. As the front of the camera's collapsed, that arm goes back down the track out of the way. That's just our post coming through here. That's nice and smooth. Right, so our coupling for the shaft that comes through from the back of the camera. I'll apply a bit of grease on here, some on the inside, and just a very brief wipe on the outside. This pops in here, couples to that shaft, so that as I turn it here, you may see the gear at the back there. Well, you can't see it because it's down the hole somewhere, but the gear at the back is turning. This shroud goes over it. Now that is somewhat scarred up. It's got scratches all over it, which will be accidental damage caused by whoever was farting around trying to get the shutter release to work, bending things at random. This screw is quite scarred, so I'm making sure that I put it at the bottom where it won't be seen. This screw is marginally better. It's still ugly, but it's not as ugly. I'll put that at the top. Put the uglier one down the bottom here. Now here I'm checking to make sure that this arm doesn't foul against here. There's any number of scratches on this thing where people have been poking at it with screwdrivers and stuff. That's good, that's not rubbing. That shutter action is good. Focus action feels good. On some cameras there will be well, the camera it stopped at some point there. I haven't worked out yet at what point it had stopped, but it had certainly stopped. I presume I'd hit a file size limit. The battery's looking good at the moment. Regardless, I'm putting the door on the front of this at the moment, so I'm just putting some grease in that slot there and there. Slide the door on, and I should have a couple of screws for this. Hinge pin screws. There are 3 of these screws that are pretty much identical. Yeah, there's a couple of blobs here of hardened adhesive that have come off. There's one washer. Is there another? There may only be one. Let's assume there's one. I'm going to put that washer on the top of the door here at this pin. That screw there. That screw is a little bit mutilated looking. The slot in the screw, I mean. Just checking that's moving smoothly. Now the one at the bottom, I've got to be careful here not to let this shaft come out, otherwise I'll be in deep trouble. I might do something else first before I flip the camera up.